from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Kevin Cirilli on Capitol Hill, where Boeing CEO has faced a grilling on the 737 MAX. Alex Harris on Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, opening the door, at least, to loosening rules in order to address that repo problem. And from London, we're going to talk with David Merritt on what looks to be Britain's third general election in 4 years. So, Kevin, meanwhile, it's been, I think, fairly dramatic testimony from Dennis Muilenburg up there, this Boeing CEO. What have we learned?
Well, Dennis Muilenburg, CEO of Boeing, telling lawmakers that Boeing has remorseful for what happened following the downing of those two Boeing 737 MAX airliners last year. We're now on that one-year anniversary. Also saying that Boeing has made key changes internally from a procedural standpoint and also a structural standpoint. They've reevaluated all of the various computer capabilities of their MCAS technology system, which, of course, is the technology that the Boeing 737 MAX airliners utilize. Lawmakers in both parties say that they will not let Boeing 737s take off again until they are 110% confident that consumer safeties are going to be completely verified. So that's the policy standpoint of this. From a practical matter, Dennis Muilenburg was asked on his way in by reporters whether or not he was going to resign. He said that his focus right now is entirely on safety. And beyond that, we should note that while Dennis Muilenburg is going to be testifying in the Senate today, the House tomorrow, the Department of Justice still has that criminal investigation looking into matters. And lawmakers, especially Democrats, not just looking at Boeing, but also looking at the international regulatory regime, the domestic regulatory regime, and the role that Wall Street investors played in perhaps pushing Boeing a little bit too fast to get behind technology that wasn't quite ready.
And one of the things, Kevin, he was pressed on, Mr. Muilenburg, was Boeing totally candid with the FAA as they were developing the MCAS system? Did they reveal any flaws or concerns about it? I didn't think he answered that very directly.
No, he did not. And that one key exchange has been something that Democrats in particular have really been pressing on, is how Boeing disclosed information to the regulators. Now, I can also tell you, and this is important to note, David, I've spoken with Republicans and Democrats within the past couple of days, all of whom are somewhat very critical of Boeing as it relates to the MAX 737s. But they've also noted the role that Boeing plays, not just domestically, but also internationally. 5 million people fly on a Boeing aircraft every day, and of course that the impact that this has from an economic standpoint and the ecosystem in American manufacturers as well as supply chains. So a lot of attention placed on Boeing in that regard as well.
Yeah, and as you say, a lot on Mr. Muilenburg's shoulders right now up there on Capitol Hill. Many thanks to Bloomberg Chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli. And now we turn to Alex Harris here in New York. So a revelation, actually, to Bloomberg today from the Treasury Secretary about how they might approach the repo problem.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, Secretary Mnuchin's leaving the door open, that you could discuss a loosening of some of the regulations here. I mean, honestly, there's so many bank regulators between the Fed, the OCC, and the FDIC that I wouldn't be surprised if we get some questions on this tomorrow at Jerome Powell's press conference after the decision's released.
Well, and what role maybe Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan, played in all this? Because Jamie Dimon was saying, listen, the department, we would have put in more cash into the system. We really couldn't because of the regulations. And maybe the government's responding to that.
Maybe. I mean, it's very well a possibility. I mean, this isn't going to be an overnight, solution. We're going to be looking at this for months to come. But I think the other important thing is that this is an acknowledgement that the market's not working properly. You had all these changes post-financial crisis. The market structure's changed. The Fed has been in. Central banks have been involved. It's like market's not working in this capacity in the way that it used to. And we're hearing from a lot of the smaller dealers in the repo market that are saying, this doesn't work for us. There are ways to make this more equitable, to get more players in here, to get money moving again. And, why keep everything concentrated with the big banks?
The market may not be working properly, but the question is whose responsibility is to fix it? Because as you suggest, they haven't thought the Fed is going to do things in order through the New York Fed to really increase liquidity. Now maybe Jay Powell tomorrow can say, wait a second, I think we can wait for Mr. Mnuchin.
Yeah, I think it's very well possible that this isn't going to just come from one regulator, one overseer. This this is going to take a coordinated effort, and this isn't just about, the large banks and their role in it. These are also about the non-dealer, community involved in the repo market too, because right now in these operations, it's not a fair shake. I mean, these smaller guys are having to pay up 20 to 30 basis points more than what their dealers are getting, funded in these liquidity operations for the Fed. So something has to change here. It's not just about loosening those liquidity rules for the big banks.
And maybe Mr. Mnuchin's willing to change it. Thank you so much to Alex Harris joining us today. And now we go to London to Bloomberg's senior executive editor, David Merritt. So, David, apparently Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is going to get the election he's so badly wanted.
That's right. Finally, after all the debate and the speculation, the Labour Party, the opposition Labour Party, finally agreeing this morning to back this bill to have an early election within a few days. They haven't firmed up the exact date, but sometime between the 9th and the 12th of December, a pre-Christmas election. First time we've had one here in Britain since 1923. And it's going to be one of the most unpredictable elections in modern times as well. This issue of Brexit dominating, of course, but it has cut a swathe through the two main parties. And, votes on the Remain side are going to leak to the Liberal Democrats. Votes on the hard Brexit side are going to leak to Nigel Farage's Brexit party. So it's very hard to see who comes out on top. Boris Johnson, well ahead in the polls at the moment, against a very unpopular leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. But again, in this first past the post system here, very hard to see whether that's going to translate or not into a majority. If it does, well, then Britain's possibly set to leave the European Union on Mr. Johnson's terms early next year. Or we could see a Remain coalition coming around with maybe the Scottish Nationalists, the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, and we could be looking at another referendum and possibly no Brexit. Or, third possibility, we could end up with another hung parliament and back with the same numbers, and Britain could be back after this election, just for Christmas, at square one.
There's so many different possibilities, but you point to a very interesting question, which is if this election does go forward in December, when people go to the polling places, will they be voting on who should be Prime Minister, or will they be voting on whether or not to leave the European Union? Two different questions.
Well, two different questions, exactly. And Theresa May tried to ask this single question in her general election in 2017. Said, look, this is about giving me a big majority to settle the Brexit question. Well, actually, the public came back with a different answer for her. They said, the election campaign, as these things tend to do, became about all sorts of other issues, loads of domestic issues around care for the elderly, or about how much money the government's spending on things like hospitals and schools. So, you know what, that could well happen again. And this becomes a far more complex conversation than the one that the Prime Minister is asking at the moment, which is give me the authority to get Brexit done. So we'll have to see how the campaign unfolds in the weeks ahead. But the public are not being asked just to vote on one issue here. It is about who leads Britain for the next 5 years. And the visions of that from Jeremy Corbyn and from Mr. Johnson are radically different.
OK, many thanks to David Merritt reporting from London. And now we always get a check on how the markets are reacting to today's top stories, if they are at all. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, we always talk about, is it geopolitics, is it earnings? Right now, as I just look at the Bloomberg, it looks like a sort of mixed message.
You're right about that, mixed messages, and you also said, if at all. Not really a lot of movement at this point. You can make the case, perhaps, investors, as is typical, ahead of the Fed decision. Of course, the Fed meeting, as you and one of our other reporters was just talking about, the meeting starting today. So very, very small moves. Earnings a little bit mixed, so mixed messages there in terms of healthcare doing really well. Alphabet putting up a little bit of a lackluster quarter in terms of growth. To be fair to Alphabet, though, 20% revenue growth, a lot less than 100% revenue growth 15 years ago, but still for such a big company. But then there's Beyond Meat absolutely plunging. Their quarter was OK. Competition's heating up, the lockup expiring. So beneath the surface movement, but on top, investors probably waiting for that Fed.
So what's taking the NASDAQ down? Was it Alphabet?
Yeah, mainly Alphabet is one of the big losers. But you also have Apple down. They report tomorrow down about 2%. A lot of those big names, Microsoft, Amazon. So it seems as though some today are throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or however you say that saying. It seems like there's not a lot of discerning among those big tech names. A little bit of a pause there. But if you recall, so many all-time highs. And in fact, the S&P 500 and the stocks putting in all-time highs. But that NASDAQ 100, not today.
How about that? OK, thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle. Always good to get a market check from her. In the meantime, we want to turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, President Trump and China's Xi Jinping reportedly will sign an interim interim trade deal next month. That's according to the South China Morning Post newspaper. The two leaders will be in Chile to attend the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman testifies today before the three House committees leading an impeachment inquiry into President Trump. Vindman was on the July telephone call with the president of Ukraine. In a prepared statement, he said he was concerned by the call and witnessed other incidents in which administration officials conditioned aid to Ukraine on an investigation of former Vice President Joe Biden. U.S. Senator and Democratic presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren believes it should be harder for the largest U.S. companies to hire former government officials. In a post published today, she vowed that a Warren administration would ban some companies from hiring senior government officials for at least 4 years and impose multi-million-dollar fines for violations. She says it's part of her plan to tackle corruption in Washington. Those wildfires in California have gotten worse, and now the blackouts will continue. California utilities may cut electricity today to as many as 2.5 million people. It's the latest in a series of unprecedented power cutoffs aimed at preventing fires. At least 10 large wildfires are burning across the state, prompting hundreds of thousands of evacuations. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up, the UK is set for its third general election since 2015. But will Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plan for an early poll break the Brexit gridlock? We ask Heather Conley of CSIS. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
The deal is there, and it is ready to be approved by a new Parliament. And it will have a government that is yearning with every fibre of its being to be able to get on and deliver our one nation conservative agenda.
That, of course, was British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He was speaking in Parliament earlier today, and it looks like he's going to finally get that general election that he has wanted so badly. To take us through how the election could change the Brexit calculus, we welcome now Heather Conley. She is Senior Vice President for the Europe Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies down in Washington. So, Heather, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody says this is a very unpredictable election, if in fact it does happen in December. What do you expect?
Well, I think we're going to see a political fragmentation of the likes we have not seen in the UK. We may see this, what they call tactical voting, which is going to be the parties that support a softer Brexit or remaining in the EU will try to tactically vote in certain constituencies. And we don't know how the Brexit party is going to do, either Nigel Farage's party. So quite frankly, we've never seen an election in December in the UK since the 1920s, and we've never seen this type of political fragmentation attempting to find a majority in Parliament. It's going to be an extraordinary election if they have it in December.
Whenever we see an election anywhere in the world, turnout is an issue. This, if it happens, will be in December. As I understand, that has not happened, as you said, for a very long time in Great Britain. What might that mean for turnout? And if turnout actually is suppressed, what might that lead to?
Right. Well, again, what many UK politicians are saying right now, in mid-December, you're almost to the longest and darkest days of December, particularly in the far north. They may only have 6 hours of sunlight. That could depress turnout. People don't want to go and stand in lines in the dark. There's a question of the age of the voters right now in the House of Commons. They're arguing whether to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to participate. Why they're angling about the timing of this. They want university students to be able to vote, and they want them to be in school so they can be organized to do that. But if, in fact, turnout is low, as we know in our own elections, usually the people that are the most motivated turn out. And if you have a low turnout, you're going to have the most extremes on both ends, both those who want a very hard, determined, clear Brexit and those who want to remain. So you, again, may get a very skewed parliament. This is the irony of this election. It may not produce a parliament majority for anything, even if they go to a new election.
We're talking with Heather Conley from CSIS down in Washington about Brexit, of course. At the same time, in politics, you can't beat somebody with nobody. I can imagine people rallying around Boris Johnson. Whatever you think of him, he's a very powerful figure. Is it likely they're going to rally around Mr. Corbyn on the other side?
So that is the problem. Here you have Boris Johnson, unlike Theresa May, very charismatic, very popular with these very catchy phrases like do or die. He will certainly be formidable out on the campaign trail. But Jeremy Corbyn, when they went to an election in June of 2017, actually surprised people on the campaign trail. He did quite well, and Labour did much better. Again, the opinion polls 2 years ago had Conservatives 18 points ahead, and of course they lost their majority in that election. But you're right, Jeremy Corbyn is the most unpopular political figure in the UK. He's, since records began holding opinion polls for leaders. If the Labour Party would somehow not have Jeremy Corbyn at the top of its ticket, I think they'd have different electoral fortunes. So there is lots of very intense feelings within the Labour Party about Jeremy Corbyn and his future as their leader.
We're talking with Heather Conley of CSIS in Washington. And Heather, I'd like to turn now from Brexit across to the channel to the European continent. We had a historic turnover yesterday from Mario Draghi to Madame Lagarde as head of the ECB. And in the course of that, he made it pretty clear he thinks that actually it's not enough to have monetary policy. They need some more help. This is part of what he said.
Today, we are in a situation where low interest rates are not delivering the same degree of stimulus as in the past, because the rate of return on investment in the economy has fallen. Monetary policy can still achieve its objective, but it can do so faster and with fewer side effects, negative side effects, if fiscal policies are aligned with it.
So Heather Conley, he says that we need some fiscal help here. What are the chances that Madame Lagarde, who comes from a different background, she's not an economist, could get that, or for that matter, the new regime, as it were, who's running the European Commission?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the challenge. What Mario Draghi's tenure at the ECB did was allow and give space and time for Europe to reform itself, do some structural reforms, reform labor laws, create that fiscal space, particularly a lot of German stimulus and investment to try to get growth back. And I think what is clear is that the monetary chamber is out of bullets. They can't do much more as Europe looks, as growth weakens further. I mean, this is quite frightening if the ECB doesn't have the monetary ability to try to change those dynamics. Politically, Europe is extremely fragmented, and Madame Lagarde has to come in both to sort of heal the divisions on the ECB Governing Council, of which there are deep divides north and south, but she has to really push European political leaders, particularly Germany, to take steps that they simply do not want to take. And so that will be her great test, and hopefully more successful than Mario Draghi was during his tenure.
Any chance that actually her biggest ally will not be Germany, but actually France? Because they have had some reform in France, and there are reports out that it's having some effect, particularly in unemployment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think this is in part why French President Emmanuel Macron, really his domestic reform agenda is strongly linked with his European reform agenda. You have to get that street credibility to say, look, I've taken the hard steps. I know what it takes. Now we need to see some space given for Europe to be able to do some reforms as well. So I think Madame Lagarde comes at a point where she's worked politically with global financial leaders. She has that credibility, but minimizing this gulf where German leaders, particularly Jens Weidmann, the head of the German Bundesbank, really don't like the direction that the ECB has been taking. And it will be interesting to see whether she will be able to charm him into agreeing to her ways.
Good luck with that. But okay, thank you so much. That's Heather Conley of CSIS down in Washington. Still ahead, GM's deal with the UAW hurt its expected earnings for the year, but its stock is actually up. It's our stock of the hour. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Time now for the stock of the hour. General Motors is heading for its best day since June, rising more than 4%, even after cutting its full-year earnings review. Carrie Lam is here with more, and there's the question. You know, we're not going to make as much money, but the stock goes up. Why?
Well, it's really interesting. I think it's really just that the underlying fundamental story still looks pretty good. When you look at GM's third quarter print, they beat earnings per share $1.72. The estimate was $1.29. North American trucks were really strong. You had the Chevy Silverado up 18% on sales, the GMC Sierra up 38%. So that picture looks great, and it seems to be offsetting the fact that they did have to cut their guidance by about $2 on earnings for the full year because of the impact of the strike. 300,000 vehicles in production that they're not going to get back, $100 million in potential impact on labor costs. But investors really seem to be looking on the bright side with this today.
So as you know, I spoke with the chief financial officer of GM, Divya Suryadevara, early today about how the strike really affected the company.
As we went into this process, our focus was on getting an agreement that made sense for the workers as well as the business. And we think this accomplishes that. From a worker standpoint, they share in the success of the company. And from a company standpoint, we retain our flexibility. We've improved our capacity utilization. And importantly, our plan is to continue to offset the increased cost with productivity and the normal efficiencies that we would drive in the business every day. So we would characterize this as having accomplished the objectives both from the employee perspective as well as the business standpoint.
I know, Divya, you have a long-term strategic plan with Merritt. How does this strike affect that? From what you just said, it sounds like it's basically a break-even. That is to say, you'll make up an increased cost by increased productivity, or does it actually put General Motors ahead of where it was before it went into the negotiations?
David, I'd say we're executing our plan. We laid out a plan for ourselves in terms of strengthening the core business and investing in the future of mobility and making sure that we are driving an appropriate rate of return in every business that we participate in. And that's what we're doing today, and this is not going to change that. We were aware of the fact that this is a cyclical business, so we do our downturn planning. We ensure that we maintain an appropriate break even, and the focus that we have today and going forward is to maintain all of that and execute our plan.
And you need that flexibility in part because of downturns. There's ups and downs in overall demand. You're also going to need it because you're going through a major transformation, as the entire auto industry is, into electric vehicles, for example. Does this agreement allow you the flexibility you need to make electric vehicles, which, as I understand it, require far fewer workers potentially than the traditional internal combustion engine vehicles?
We are very excited about the future of electric. We believe in an all-electric future, and the investments that we've announced recently are a testament to that, between our Orion plant and our Detroit Hamtramck plant, where we've talked about our battery electric trucks. And I think all of this goes towards ensuring that we're putting the building blocks in place to win in the future of electrification, and this agreement will continue to allow us to do that.
Does the street believe her?
They actually do. They kind of see the strikes in the rearview mirror now, and GM's just going to push forward from here.
Okay, and the stock is up, as you said. Okay, many thanks now to Bloomberg's Carrie Lam. This is Bloomberg Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston, but right now we want to go to Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we turn to Mark Crumpton.
David, Boris Johnson will get what he wants to break a Brexit deadlock. The opposition Labour Party says it will support the Prime Minister's call for an early election in December. It may be the last chance voters have to choose between parties offering to cancel Brexit or force through a hard split at any cost. This will be the UK's third general election since 2015. Members of Parliament will vote later today to endorse the election plan. Lebanon's Prime Minister Saad Hariri resigned today after 2 weeks of anti-government protests descended into violence. In a televised address, Hariri said he had reached a dead end and that it was time for what he called a major shock to confront the crisis. Protesters in Beirut thanked Hariri for taking the first step to address popular demands, but they're now calling for other top officials to step down. In Hong Kong, Chief Executive Carrie Lam has denied what she calls malicious reports that she's being replaced. Lam says that she has China's support despite 4 months of protests. A pro-establishment lawmaker told Bloomberg that Beijing was looking into a plan to replace Lam. She's been unable to quell the increasingly violent demonstrations. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink predicts markets will rise further next year. Fink spoke a day after U.S. stocks climbed to a record. He's attending Saudi Arabia's Future Investment Initiative. In July, Fink advised investors not to move into cash despite trade tensions. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, before he was a Democratic member of Congress representing Illinois' 11th District, Bill Foster got a Ph.D. in physics from Harvard and spent 22 years at DOE's Fermi Lab working on high-energy particle physics. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise to any of us that in last week's House Financial Services Committee hearing, Congressman Foster would be the one who could press Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg on exactly how his proposed Libra currency might work.
Will it be possible to conduct anonymous transaction using Libra? There's a whole host of problems. So will Libra allow anonymous transactions?
I think that it is an open question.
It's pretty hard to stop anonymous trading. Have I missed something there?
Congressman, I think that this is probably more of a policy issue and question.
No, but as your code currently exists, can you transact anonymously with Libra?
Congressman, it certainly would be possible to build a system that would allow that.
Welcome now, Congressman Foster, to Bloomberg, coming from Capitol Hill. So, Mr. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. Did you get an answer, Mark Zuckerberg, please? As I understood it, that part of the reason why you were asking is if, in fact, it could be anonymous, all sorts of things can be done in this cryptocurrency Libra that maybe we wouldn't want to be done.
That's right, and it's already a huge problem for many crypto assets. You know, for any of these crypto assets, there's sort of two questions you have to answer. First, is it truly anonymous? Or is there a law enforcement agency and ultimately a court that you can go to figure out who's behind digital transactions? The other one, is there a court that you trust that allows you to reverse fraudulent or mistaken transactions? And these are the two tough policy questions that have to be answered, you know, not only for digital currencies, but digital contracts and so on.
Well, the anonymous question, I certainly is beyond my ken. I don't understand programming that much. But on the other one, on the ability to reverse, I mean, we have that with our credit cards, our Visa, our MasterCard and things. I was a little surprised that Mr. Zuckerberg wasn't ready for that to say, well, we've looked at the way they did it. We're going to try to do it the same way.
Well, it's one of the toughest issues because there have to be responsibilities on both sides. You know, if the credit card companies or the payment transaction companies are going to make consumers whole when there are mistaken or fraudulent transactions, you also have a duty to report. For example, when your ID has been stolen and someone starts to impersonate you. And so one of the things that I am working on in Congress as part of I wear several hats. One is the co-chair of the Blockchain Caucus. The other one, I'm the co-chair of a task force that we've set up on artificial intelligence in the Financial Services Committee. And one of the things we're looking at is better means for people to be able to authenticate themselves online as a specific human being. And this is going to be crucial for any payment transaction processing or actually any participation in any sort of digital contract.
Congressman Foster, we heard of a lot of the issues, possible potential problems with Libra or cryptocurrency like that. At the same time, we heard also from Mr. Zuckerberg more than once in front of you, we don't have much choice because the Chinese are already going there. We will be left behind. Does he have a point?
He absolutely does. And the space that the Chinese are moving into is the space of digital fiat currencies. These are central banks offering citizens who want the ability to transact in those currencies purely electronically. And this is something that's not unique to China. China is very aggressively going into this, but Christine Lagarde, the incoming head of the European Central Bank, has been going around giving speeches that she thinks central banks should start considering issuing digital fiat currency. So French Hill, the ranking member of the relevant subcommittee on financial services, and I wrote a letter to the Federal Reserve a few weeks ago encouraging them to think seriously about this and look at the parameters of a potential pilot program for the Federal Reserve issuing digital currencies, because this has all the advantages of that Mark Zuckerberg continuously points to, issue, the access for underbanked or unbanked people to have low friction electronic transactions and so on. And so they will have huge advantages, but we also have to recognize that it's a natural monopoly. And that's why a lot of the Libra proposal has the business world on edge. They understand that the 2 billion Facebook subscribers will immediately provide huge scale to whatever proposal Facebook gets aligned with, and including potentially the Libra.
As you raise natural monopoly, that necessarily takes us into broader regulatory questions, as we've had for all sorts of time, since utilities, since railroads, things like that. Let's put another one of your hats on here, and that is the area of digital advertising and the use of personal data for that. You are backing, as I understand it, something called the Dashboard Bill. Explain what that would do.
Yeah, it's something that's being introduced by Senators Hawley and Warner in the Senate, and we're going to be introducing it, the House Companion Bill. And what this does is it provides consumers some transparency on which of their data is being collected and how it is being monetized, as well as providing citizens some limited ability to delete information that is being used. And so what I asked Mr. Zuckerberg in our hearing is if we could have a technical reading on what's easy and hard about that to implement and comply with.
And one of the questions is, would we pay attention to it? I mean, those of us out in the real world, because we get all of these agreements online all the time, I frankly don't even look at it. It just says, click at the bottom and say you accept. It's pages and pages. Do we think the consumers actually would pay attention, read that stuff, and actually make a decision, an informed decision?
Well, I think what consumers would like to see is some standardization of those terms. If you knew, for example, this is a type A, type B, or type C disclosure, where type C basically says, use my data for whatever you want. Type A says, use this only for the transaction that we're about to engage in, and then throw it away and never use it for anything else. And then type B was a more nuanced one that allowed a limited use for the company, ability for the company to monetize it. That some simple set of options like that are, I think, at the limit of what a consumer would like to deal with. And I hope that the regulators and industry starts to encourage more standardization of those terms and conditions.
Finally, Congressman, take us behind the scenes, because we've heard from Mr. Zuckerberg and others that they really do think that the time has come for regulation. They want to work with you on doing that. Are they working with you behind the scenes? Is Facebook being cooperative and trying to think through these things in a responsible way?
Yeah, well, prior to the rollout, they came through with a representative of Facebook and a representative of the Libra Association, and I had an individual, quite long discussion with them about many of the technical details. You know, discussions about the extent to which Libra, depending on how it's structured, might or might not affect monetary policy of the currencies that it is bundling together. And so they have been very good at making themselves available to us. On the other hand, a lot of the tough questions, as you saw in the hearing, are ones they have not yet provided clear answers to. And this is, I think, the next step in this discussion.
Okay, Congressman, really good to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. This is Congressman Bill Foster. He's a Democrat of Illinois. Coming up, Speaker Pelosi calls for impeachment to be put to a vote, while Republicans deride the probe into President Trump as illegitimate. We discuss this next phase of impeachment with our panel. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on television and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The first White House official is testifying in the House impeachment probe. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, an Army officer and Ukraine expert on National Security Council, has arrived on Capitol Hill and will speak behind closed doors to 4 House committees. Welcome now our political panel. In Washington, Al Motter. He is partner at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck. He also sat on the Hillary for America National Finance Committee. And in Austin, Texas, Jason Johnson, owner of J2 Strategies and former chief advisor to Senator Ted Cruz. So, gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Let me start with you, Jason. This is now a lieutenant colonel who's assigned to the National Security Council. By all accounts, in his testimony, which we've seen a copy of in advance of the prepared testimony, he was saying he was deeply concerned about one of the conversations President Trump had, because it didn't really involve national security. It seemed to be political, and reported that to the chief counsel of the NSC. Is there any denying that this man is a patriot that we should listen to carefully?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's a mistake for anyone to claim that someone who served our country honorably, who's actually risked their life, is anything less than a patriot. At the same time, I think it's a mistake for any of us to assume that anyone who's serving in any capacity in Washington, D.C. is not also political, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, Al, let's go to you on the political question. Is it a fair argument to make, listen, you can't take politics out of any decision made in Washington ever. There's always some politics. And by the way, politics is what you have in a democracy. So why should it be wrong for the President of the United States to express some concern about what he said was corruption, even involved a political adversary?
Well, he expressed concern about a political adversary and said there was corruption. There's no evidence to date that there was any corruption. This has been looked at every which way, including by the Ukrainians, who said, we see nothing here. The key to this witness's testimony is not that he's a patriot, which he is, or a decorated veteran, which he is, but that he was a staffer in the White House who heard this call, who said this is a problem, reported it up to his superiors, not for politics, because he was doing his job, and he said, I'm concerned about this, and as we now know, nothing happened.
So, Jason, one of the things that we've heard a fair amount of criticism of the Democrats is it's behind closed doors. We saw them storming the hearing room last week. Now, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is going to have a vote on Thursday. Once she has that vote and they're open, does that issue go away?
Well, in my opinion, it does. I suspect there will still be a fair number of Republicans who will claim that, since Nancy Pelosi initiated impeachment proceedings without a vote initially, that anything that happened behind closed doors is not legitimate. I think we need to move past that. Look, she's doing the right thing now. If they want to impeach the President of the United States, they have to go on record. They have to have a vote to open this inquiry, and finally the President and Republicans will be granted the rights that they're entitled to mount a defense. And so I personally hope all of these process arguments go away and we can get on to the business of determining, examining, even if you don't like what the President did here, in an election year, do we really believe that this is a high crime and misdemeanor, an impeachable offense? That's what we need to move to now.
So Al, a lot of people ask the question, actually Jason just asked, why don't you just open it up and eliminate the procedural argument? Now she's going to do it, the Speaker of the House. Some people have thought maybe because it puts some of her members, particularly her first-year members, on the spot in sort of purplish districts. Are some people more exposed now if they have to go on the record on the question of whether there should be an impeachment inquiry?
I don't really think so, because they were going to have to go on the record regardless. Once they moved to this process, it was inevitable that there was going to be a vote in the House on whether to impeach the president. So now there'll be two votes, one to open it up publicly, the second whether to impeach. And that is going to happen regardless, and I frankly think he's going to be impeached. But Jason raises a good point, which is to say that we have an election now under a year away, and it's likely that many people will say, let's use that as the barometer, not removal from office in the U.S. Senate.
Okay, Al Motter and Jason Johnson will be staying with us because we're going to turn to that election next year, talk about the state of the 2020 race. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Democrats are getting nervous about how the man who had been their front runner, former Vice President Joe Biden, may do in Iowa. Bloomberg's Tyler Pager has a piece out on the Bloomberg right now. It's entitled Biden in Danger of Humiliating Loss in Iowa. We welcome Tyler now from Washington. So, Tyler, why are Democrats getting so nervous?
Right. So I spoke to nearly a dozen senior Democrats in the crucial first caucus state of Iowa, and they say that Joe Biden's operation there is just not up to snuff. They say he hasn't done good enough political outreach to key party and state leaders. And at the same time, they say that his campaign there has not reached the voters in a similar way to Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or even Bernie Sanders, and that he's in real danger of having a poor performance there.
So why would that be? I mean, he has run for president before. He saw President Obama do a really terrific job in Iowa. He sort of saw the ground game approach, and he knows in Iowa you got to meet with individuals. So why would it be that he wouldn't get it done?
Right. So some people say that he's running sort of an entitled campaign, feeling that he is the former vice president. He's run for president 3 times now. And so that he should be almost crowned just the winner based on that. And the work on the ground is not being done. In Iowa, where voters have to show up in public gathering spots to caucus for a candidate, on the ground organizing is really important, and they have just not invested that kind of time or effort into that. At the same time, another criticism is that Joe Biden is reliant on high-dollar fundraisers, which forces him to crisscross the country, spending time with private donors and raising that kind of money, and that takes away from his time on the campaign trail.
Okay, Tyler, really great reporting. Thank you so much. That's Bloomberg's Tyler Pager in Washington. And now let's bring back our political panel of Al Mater from Brownstein Farber in Washington and Jason Johnson at J2 Strategies in Austin, Texas. So, Al, I'll consider you a prominent Democrat. Are you concerned about Vice President Biden in Iowa?
Well, I'm not concerned about him because I believe in the meritocracy of the process. And I think if he's successful, good for him and good for the party. But I'm perfectly comfortable with the whole host of candidates that we have running. I think that we have great candidates on the left, great candidates in the middle. And I think that we will anoint somebody who's perfectly capable of taking the fight to President Trump, whether it's Joe Biden or somebody else.
Taking it to President Trump, but winning, can someone from the left, let's pick somebody at random, Elizabeth Warren, do you think that she can win the general, Al?
Not sure that's at random, David, but, if she ends up winning the primary process, then yes. The elections have a way of defining candidates differently from where they are at the beginning. And whoever our nominee is going to be is somebody who's appealed to a broad spectrum of voters in the Democratic Party process and somebody who can take the fight to the president. And what a nominee looks like in July of 2020 is entirely different than what media caricatures look like in the fall of 2019.
Yeah, it's a very poor point. So, Jason, play it from the other side of it. Is President Trump going to be just as happy if Vice President Biden stumbles in Iowa?
Well, I think if you buy into the argument, which I'll point out, I agree with what I just heard, the way these candidates are viewed now versus after the nomination is very different. And as such, I don't put a lot of stock in these, hypothetical matchups for next November. Having said that, I think everyone generally agrees that if you look across at all the polls, the argument has been that Joe Biden is the strongest candidate to face Donald Trump next November. I would simply point out for the Biden campaign and for those Democrats who believe that that's true, that he's the strongest candidate, you ask yourself, what do Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, John Kerry, Al Gore all have in common? They all won the Iowa caucuses. The Iowa caucuses have not necessarily predicted who the Republican nominee for president is going to be, but on the Democrat side has an incredible track record of predicting the nominee. And when you see the Biden campaign already downplaying expectations in Iowa, and Tyler's reporting was amazing. I don't remember ever seeing a state director respond to a major news outlet when asked a question by hanging up the phone. It really points to a real disaster of a campaign in Iowa for Biden.
Yeah, the question was, where do you live? And he hung up the phone because he didn't want to say he didn't live in Iowa. We're speaking with Al Mater, a Democratic strategist, and Jason Johnson, a Republican strategist. So, Al, let me come back to you on what Jason just said. As a Democrat, can Vice President Biden win the nomination without either winning or doing very well in Iowa? Can he have a strategy that says, I'll give up Iowa, maybe even New Hampshire, because I have a couple of neighboring senators there, and really fight it out in South Carolina?
He can, but it's tough. Jason's correct that we have not nominated anybody who has not won Iowa in many years. You have to go back to 1992 when Bill Clinton was the nominee, and he, in fact, lost Iowa and New Hampshire, you might recall. But it is exceedingly difficult. The person who came closest was then Senator Clinton in 2008. She was a front runner like Joe Biden is now, was stunned a bit in Iowa, but she came back and ran a spirited campaign and almost captured the nomination. So that would be the path, to go on and win on Super Tuesday, to win in the South, to win in South Carolina, as you pointed out, which, by the way, he would absolutely have to win if he's going to stay in the race and compete. The other thing I would note, and it hasn't been talked about yet in this segment, is that the vice president, notwithstanding his big dollar fundraising, is lagging some of his competitors in dollars raised. And that's something to continue to look at. it's one thing to say I can lose Iowa and New Hampshire and compete if you have a big war chest. But if he doesn't have the money to compete and he loses in those states, that could become a big problem for him. So the path is tough. It's there because he is someone who appeals to a lot of people in our party. And our party is more moderate than the activists on Twitter would make you think it is. But it's a tough path.
And Jason, quite apart from the money raised, if you look at the funds on hand last time we saw with Vice President Biden, he was behind in that as well. Money is terribly important in these elections. At this point, perhaps more important than the polls. Let me shift this over a little bit from the presidential that we all focus on. Let's go over to the House and the Senate, because there are also reports out today that, in fact, Republicans are lagging in the senatorial races, and that people are starting to get a little nervous on the Republican side about what happens in the Senate, which everybody thought was safe, and much less the House.
Yeah, I think the Republicans suffer from an expectations game. You know, when I talk to Republicans, particularly more establishment-type donors, there's really a belief that the Senate is safe no matter what. And I think, you know, we all are you know, susceptible to our own biases. And most Republicans, when they look at this impeachment process, think, particularly because it's an election year, that it's a sham. And then they therefore take this giant leap to think that all, you know, independent and moderate voters are going to draw the same conclusions. It's not necessarily true. So it is true. Republicans have got to get out, start raising money, and take these races seriously, because we don't know what's going to happen in a year and a month from now.
Very
really
well said. Okay, thank you very much to our political panel. Terrific panel. Jason Johnson in Austin, Texas, and Al Motter in Washington. Coming up on Balance of Power, we're going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk with former prosecutor Jessica Roth for the latest legal angles on impeachment. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on radio.